Ellie Mae O'Hagan is a regular contributor to The Guardian and an associate of Neon, a network of over 1,600 organizers across the UK that, quotes, built the strength of movements of economic, environmental, and social justice. Sounds like some great work you're doing right now, and well-needed work. Ellie, thank you for joining the Nomiki show. I guess I just want to start off with a big question. Is it time to pack it up? Are we done? Sexism's over?
No, we're never done. I wish it was. No.
So Wall Street, I'm sure you saw the news, it just brought on its first female CEO. And we had booked you before this news came out, which is perfect because you did an article a few years ago in The Guardian talking about the gender equity gap, but specifically feminism without socialism is not really possible and will never cure our unequal society. And, you know, there's some real zingers in here about you lead at the top of this article saying that scrolling through the list of FTSE 350 companies, one will find such as HSBC, which was fined $1.4 billion for helping drug cartels launder money in Mexico, Sports Direct, where workers have been exploited to the extent that one woman gave birth in toilets, and G4S, a company so mired in scandal that it has an entire Wikipedia page dedicated solely to the amount of controversies it has amassed. And you asked the question of the day, if a company behaves terribly but its director is a woman, is that still feminism? So here we are today with the CEO of Citibank, now a woman, and Wall Street and the New York Times say that the glass ceiling has been cracked. What is it going to take for society, for journalists, for people who are over the age of 40 maybe, to understand the ties between the feminist fight and the class struggle?
Well, I think that's the problem, isn't it? That's what's difficult about it, is that I think that article that I wrote was sort of in response to the pinkification, if you like, of International Women's Day. And I think that as feminism has become more and more prominent, you know, with things like the Me Too movement, and there's been lots of feminist street movements over the last kind of 5-10 years, I think that the more mainstream iterations of feminism have kind of tried to argue that being feminism means being a woman, essentially. But I think that if you're talking about feminism just from the point of view of I'm a woman and I'm proud of that, but you're not talking about it in terms of what it means to have power and not to have power, and what it means to have power in relation to the people around you and the structures that you operate in, then really being a woman is no more of a useful identity than like being a stamp collector is. Do you know what I mean? It actually has to mean something in relation to the world. And so that's where, when you have somebody like, you know, the CEO of Citibank being a woman, well, I'm sure that just as a woman, of course, she will have experienced sexism just as a woman in and of herself. There's no denying that. And I'm sure that she will have climbed the corporate ladder slower than a man in her position, you know, of the same sort of class and race. But look at what Citibank did to the American people. And the people who suffered the most from the financial crisis were women.
Right.
And so, to me, feminism means nothing unless it talks about the lives of the majority of women. And the majority of women in this world are poor, and they are women of colour. So if your feminism isn't really talking about that, I just think it has extremely limited use. And that's why, for me, saying that a woman is the CEO of Citibank, I think that's just a very limited form of feminism, and I think that it's quite poor in its ambition. But going back to the question that you're asking, which is why people are finding this so hard, well, because if we start to talk about feminism in terms of power, then we start to talk about feminism in terms of capitalism. And then we have to start talking about what's wrong with capitalism. And most people who control discussions don't really want to do that because they are involved in institutions that benefit from capitalism, and I think that's the problem.
So, you know, you said something very interesting in your piece, saying gender inequality may be a necessary condition of capitalism, but it is maintained by culture. I've never heard it said so well, because when we say culture, I'll lead down to another part of the piece where you mentioned the International Women's Day. Like, this was in response to International Women's Day essentially being co-opted by the greater feminist, whatever that movement is, the cultural feminist movement. So some of this is rooted in, I believe, the disconnection from specifically trade unions. And International Women's Day is something that grew out of, as you mentioned in the piece, it grew out of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fires here in New York, where it was led by women. It was a factory with women, young women, girls, and of course the labor movement that came out of that led by women. But somewhere in the mix, the trade part got out, and it became more about women's empowerment. So let's talk a little bit about how culture is used to shape how women are supposed to behave as feminists. What are some of the most jarring examples that you can think of that we may not necessarily associate with a way of preserving the cultural aspects of capitalism?
Well, if I understand do I understand your question right, to ask about how culture has sort of maintained capitalism? Is that what you're?
Yeah, I mean, when you're saying that feminism is the culture around feminism is actually becoming a tool of capitalism, like maintaining capitalism. The branding around it.
I think it's sort of I think it basically what it's doing is it's taking the bite out of feminism, right? Like it's making feminism into a sort of identity choice, into in the same way as like you might be able to express your kind of individual identity by buying a certain kind of coffee. I buy a flat white with oat milk, and I'm a feminist. And I think that like that, and the benefit of that to women is that it's not threatening. If a woman can say I'm a feminist and that's kind of who I am, but not really talk about what that means in practice, then that's not threatening to men, and that's quite beneficial to women because men structurally as a class they control more things than women, so you don't really want to be threatening than men. But also in women's sort of interpersonal relationships with men are stronger and they can be more dangerous and they feel more entitled. This is talking in very general terms, just your male viewers. I'm not saying every single man is like this. I'm just talking about how we're permitted to behave with one another in terms of our gender identities. So I think that like sort of mainstream feminism is quite appealing to lots of women, because it enables you to sort of feel that you're being empowered and that you can make choices that are feminist, but you don't actually have to disrupt the sort of power structure that exists already, because doing that is quite scary. And that is where all the kind of stuff about feminists being man haters and all this kind of thing, and like and actually it being a bit of a dangerous thing for women to do, to come in. And so I think it is very appealing, the kind of feminism that like has been co-opted by capitalism. But the problem is that ultimately it's useless. And actually, interestingly, there are studies that show that women who tend to be feminist, who identify as feminist, tend to have more positive views of men than women who don't. And I think that's because women who really think about feminism and sort of integrate it into their lives, first of all, surround themselves with really like good men, and second of all, are able to understand what's going on in their lives and their relationships with men in a structural way, rather than being just frustrated about their kind of interpersonal relationships. So yeah, I think that like on the one hand it is appealing to women to sort of have this very safe form of feminism, but on the other hand it's useless, and I feel like it will ultimately it does more harm than good to women. So
what are some ways we can integrate the conversation around class issues and inequity back into the feminist equation? I mean, even unions have sort of disconnected these two things. Even the feminist fights of the 60s and 70s were geared around reproductive rights, which there's a very serious argument to be made about, that tied into class. I mean, who are the ones who are at risk the most? Of course, most vulnerable members of our society, poor women and women of color and undocumented women who are, especially in red states here in the U.S. how do we weave that back into the conversation? How do the feminists that understand that this is an intersectional battle and it's not, based on whatever the brand is or whatever the electoral fight is of that moment, or in opposition to Republicans even, how do we bring that into like the mainstream so that we can actually make some progress?
Well, I think first of all, you're absolutely right to talk about trade unions. I think the whole basis of trade unions is this sort of unequal power imbalance between the worker and the boss. And the majority of people in this world who are in work are women, and those women are concentrated in low-paid, low-status jobs. So organising those women, giving them collective power or supporting them to take their own collective power is absolutely cannot happen without that. I also think, I know this is particularly difficult in America, but I also think the question of welfare is extremely important because obviously women are the main carers and they do rely on public services much more than men. They need healthcare more than men do. They tend to be the primary care of children, so they rely on education, childcare services. And of course, women need to escape violent relationships more often than men do, and so they need places to go and they need money. There's a great book by two sex workers called Revolting Prostitutes, that make the point that the majority of women go into sex work because they want to get money. And I think often it is that simple. Give women money. That's a really good way of being a feminist, like create structures and systems and ways that women can get money, because when you live in a capitalist society, if you don't have money, you don't really have very much. So I think that's looking at ways to do that, but then also making sure that feminism is relevant to most women's lives, not just middle class white women's lives, which I think is a problem with contemporary feminism. Particularly, I can't really speak for America as much as here, but definitely in Britain that is a problem. So talking about the issues that matter to most women, so childcare, work, pay, welfare, housing, these are feminist issues. There's no way that you can talk about these issues without understanding that the majority of people who need to deal with this stuff are women.
Absolutely. And I mean, the housing crisis in New York, for instance, I'll just throw out a little piece of information I learned a few years ago. We have public housing in New York. It's the number one housing provider. In fact, with every single person who lives in public housing in New York City, it would equal the size of Boston. So when you think about public housing, and majority are people of color who live in public housing in New York City, and it is the only area where there are female-led homes. And so we started to dig into it a little bit more, talk about the intersectionality of other issues. Black and brown communities, because of the crime laws in the U.S., 1 in 3 black men were put in jail. Now, if you've gone to jail, you cannot return to public housing. That is against the law. So suddenly these homes are being led by women solely, and many homes, hundreds of thousands, solely, and families are literally being pulled apart from each other. So, all these issues kind of overlap with each other. And I think, obviously by design, I mean, there's redlining in this country. So white feminists just may not even be aware of how structurally difficult it is for women who do not make as much as they do or don't live in the same neighborhood. So it's interesting. I find it, I'm glad that this is a conversation that's coming up more, and white women are having, feminists are able to talk about their white feminism more. But what do you think are some ways to speak to more of the pussy hat wearing feminists out there, the pink hat, and bring them into a conversation about class and really challenging their own class, their own privilege?
That's a really, I would. Am I allowed to swear on this show?
Sure. I don't know if we get banged.
If I knew the
I actually don't know.
I would. Yeah. Well, let me see if I can put it in PG-13 terms. Then, if I knew how to win around white middle class feminists, there would be more of them would like me. I tend to get on their nerves with talking about this stuff. I think the first thing to say is to amplify the voices of women of colour and I mean, in this country, we have a problem with transphobia in our feminist movement. So I would say also, particularly this country, trans women, and then also sex workers. And I don't just mean that in terms of representation. I mean that also because, and I hope this doesn't sound too patronizing, but I actually think those groups have much more interesting and informative feminism than white middle class women, because they have the experience of being excluded from what, the definition of woman, which is usually implicitly white, cisgendered, middle class. And especially like when it comes to sex workers, they are so on the sharp end of patriarchy that they really know what they're talking about. And I always feel like I learn so much more from listening to those people than I do from listening to middle-class white women. And I think one of the big reasons for that is that they tend to talk about women as real people inhabiting the world, whereas I feel that sort of mainstream feminism, kind of white feminism, talks about women as symbols quite a lot, rather than talking about the lived reality of women's lives. So I think that the first thing is to really read those people, amplify them, and sort of share what they have to say. But I think in terms of getting white feminists to acknowledge their class, I think the first thing for those of us wanting that to happen is to understand that they do stand to lose quite a lot, because patriarchy is rubbish. It's not nice. It's not nice to be on the receiving end of the bad stuff that patriarchy dishes out. And when you're white and middle class, you can shield yourself a lot from that. And so there's quite a lot of incentive for white middle class women to sort of stick to where they are. And of course, in America, you can see that in the sort of legacy of, and in this country as well, but I think it's talked about more in America, that you can see that with the history of white women often aligning themselves with white men at the expense of women of color. So they side with their race over their gender. You saw that in the last election with white women voting Trump more than Clinton, which really shows something, right? Because she really worked the whole "I'm a woman" thing, and yet
and into that point, just if I can interject for 1 second, what really was lost in that conversation was these are white women who the majority were voting with their partners, male partners in particular. So what you just said, they side with gender. I don't know if it was necessarily because it was something that Hillary said. It was more that their partners, traditionally, who they vote with anyways, were voting for Trump.
Yeah, and I'm not sure. I don't feel familiar enough with the way that the American electorate works to comment on that. But in this country, it's definitely the case that I did some work on this last year, that women would vote with their partners because they didn't feel very confident in terms of their political knowledge. So they would kind of just go along with what their partners were saying, particularly if they lived in quite traditional structures. So there was a sense that the man was the sort of head of the household. And then, they would vote together. They would drive to the voting booth together. And then that would exacerbate this idea of, I should just vote with how he's voting. But what I also noticed is that women, on the whole, tend to be more interested in their communities and more interested in their relationships and their connections than men. And so that is one possible way of kind of driving a wedge between women and voting in a right-wing way, is encouraging them to think. And I think maybe this could work with feminism, encouraging women to think about the political issues in terms of their own relationships and their own communities, because that was something that I picked up last year when I was doing public opinion work, is that on politics in this country, is that women were much more likely to think about, their local doctor's surgery, or the kind of the local council and how all of that was going when they were thinking about politics than men were.
I mean, some of this, I always find, I love going to Europe, pretty much anywhere in Europe, and going to bookstores, because there's just an array of different type of writing, and some of this is just because of the corporate structures of bookstores in our country. Obviously, local bookstores are better, but I'm always blown away by how many feminist how much feminist work is at bookstores. Like, I was in Greece last year, and and it was an English bookstore, English writing, and there was like a whole section dedicated to socialist feminist work. I am not kidding you. And much of that is out of the UK. And I say this because when I came back here, I was like, why is it so hard? I have to go to a university. I have to, why is it so hard to find great work here? It's just not released with the same channels. And through that research, I found out that there's very little actual research, polling, research institutes that focus on gender and class together. Mm-hmm. So one little example is, when you run for office in America, it's very expensive, right? We don't have enough women in office. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of organizations focused on electing more women into office, reaching parity. And yet the number one obstacle for women running is raising money. And so I went to the renowned institute that studies this, and I said, could you give me some research on what are some of the struggles, why are some of the, research on women raising money and running for office? And they said, well, actually, we haven't even done that. This is the number one barrier to women running for office. You haven't done any. You've done all of this other research about what they should wear. Should they wear pointy shoes? Should they wear earrings on camera? Should they lean in? Should they lean out? It was crazy talk, and they hadn't connected the dots, or they didn't want to connect the dots. And so I bring this up because it just seems like so much of this is obvious, but because reporters aren't reporting on it through the lens of not having the research available. You were talking about looking at public polling and how voting is influenced by your partner if you're in a more traditional home. What is it going to take for us to develop the capacity, develop the infrastructure so that it's not just a theory anymore? And it's not a theory. Obviously, people have been talking about these issues for decades, Bolsheviks, as you mentioned in your piece. What is it going to take for the mainstream to connect the dots? Like, how do we develop that infrastructure? I don't mean like traditional infrastructure. Like, what are the kinds of conversations we need to have with reporters and with leaders so that they get it?
I think shame is quite a good tool here. Good. I think the way that I think people tend to just do things that they can get away with until somebody comes along and embarrasses them. So I think the way that I would want to go about something like that is by organizing women at a grassroots level and then demanding the infrastructure is built, because I don't think it's going to happen any other way, because at the moment the majority of people in power are white middle-class men, and that just suits them just fine. So they need to feel some kind of outside pressure and kind of embarrassment and fear in order to change. So that's how I would do that personally. I think there is also a problem of both seeing women as nothing more than women. So basically seeing, like, I think that, when you say they hadn't even thought of fundraising, I think, that's because there's this idea that, women will need to think about their outfits because they're women, but not about money, Like, so it's sort of seeing women as women, like, and not just kind of human beings that need, like, the fully rounded human beings that need, like, all of the other stuff that anybody would need if they were going to run for office. And I think that's another problem as well.
My last question is, you have a vibrant trade union movement in the UK. It's imperfect. How do we bring these conversations back into the trade union movement so that they are able to communicate when they talk about housing justice or fair wages or worker protections? It's not just the female-led unions that talk about it related to gender.
That's a really difficult question. I'm such a sucker for unions. I just love the trade unions. So it hurts to criticize them, but yeah, there is a problem. Of course, it's a problem. You can see that in most of the unions in the Western world. You can see that the majority of the people that they represent are women, but the majority of the people at the top of the union tend to be men. So of course, it's a problem. And I think from my experience I worked for the union movement in the UK for sort of 5 years in various different ways, and I still do consult for unions off and on. And one story to share is that there was a trade union in this country that was sort of represents workers in the fossil fuel industry, and was kind of on the fence about whether to support fracking or not. And lots of the members who didn't work in the fossil fuel industry organised themselves, went to the union's annual conference and managed to pass a motion to be anti-fracking. And it took a while for the wheels to turn, but now the union is anti-fracking and it supports anti-fracking measures. And actually at last year's Labour conference, it supported the Green New Deal and supported a net zero target by 2030, which is very ambitious. Right. This is a union that represents people in fossil fuels. So I think what I do like about unions, and they do have imperfections, I'm definitely not denying that, but what I do like about them is they are actually quite democratic. So I think if you join one as a member and you go to the meetings and you go to the conferences, I mean, they can be quite boring, but they are also the place where the democracy happens. And if you can organise enough people, you can change things in unions. You can force the union to do something. And I think it's much easier to get stuff like that done in a union than it is in a kind of corporation or a media company, for example. So, that's what I would do.
For example, yes, definitely hard to do that. Having gone through many of those rounds with other media companies, that is correct. It is not easy to do at a media company. Yeah. Ellie Mae O'Hagan, great work. We will post your article up and recent work up as well. Hope to have you back on and get some rest. The time difference is real there right now. So.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
All right, thank you very much.
Thanks for watching and listening to The Nomiki Show. But remember to click like and subscribe on YouTube, and please share on social media. If you're not already a patron, please join us for as low as $5 a month on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show for early and special content. That investment makes a huge difference. We are not corporate media raking in the dough. It's really you guys that are keeping us going. So please consider being a patron. And to our current patrons, thank you so much. We are incredibly grateful to you. We also now have swag. So check us out on thenomikishow.com to get your mugs, your totes, and your stickers.